And I was looking at our notes. We're doing pretty good. We're on track, bless you. And so I opened up a couple more PowerPoints on Canvas to get us there, basically. And so we'll finish up this one, and then we will do one with some introduction to population ecology. And then usually, like the Monday before the exam, I have just a little bitty bit of stuff I like to do with you. And then we could open up for questions and anything like that that you might have. Anything we need to review, how to make a niche again, whatever you want to do. But I like to do a brief introduction to life tables. And that's a very strict cutoff for exam 1, which I don't often do in classes. But I do that because I don't want to build life tables till after the exam. So once we hit that point, we're done for this first exam. All right? And so all of that's opened up. That also means we will not cover that entire PowerPoint. We will stop with the first couple of slides, just some background information. All right, at the end of class last time, we were talking about niches, and we talked about how Hutchinson redefined them basically as a multi-dimensional hypervolume. Somebody kick the door shut. They don't particularly like to listen to me lecture for whatever reason across the hall while they're working. Meaning that we're going to go out and measure as many things about the organism's behavior, environment, anything that we can think of that we can measure, and we're going to put that into a model, and we can do that in 1 dimension, 2 dimension, 3 dimension. But more specifically, if we're really trying to build an accurate representation, we need an n-dimensional hypervolume. But we're not going to draw, as I said Monday, anything over 2 dimensions. That's as far as we're going to draw. All right. And so if we're going to draw a 2-dimensional niche, what we're going to do is we're going to have a regular old graph with an x and y axis. And along one axis, we're going to have niche aspect, and we'll just call it number 1, whatever that happens to be. And the examples we had last time, that were things like food size, perch height, stuff like that, so whatever we want that niche aspect to be. But I want you to start thinking about this idea of niche aspects. So that's part of the reason why I'm using that terminology. And then along the y-axis, we're going to have niche aspect number 2, whatever that happens to be. Okay, so in other words, we're being hypothetical here. So again, maybe this is food length, and this one is the nutritional value, which might be weird, but we can look that up. I had to do some of that in grad school. That's probably why it popped into my head. It could be part of the tree that they're using, foraging height, it could be anything that you want to measure. Now, well, I turned it off, but so I could draw a bigger graph. But what we had last time was along the niche aspect, we had a line, and that line was showing the range that they use for that resource, and a line would represent 1 dimension, right? Essentially. We okay so far? Right. But I was trying to get you to think of that what they really are basing that line on is usually not a line, but rather a bell-shaped curve. Okay? And so if you ignore the niche aspect part over here for a minute and you think of it as frequency of this niche aspect, then there's something that they're doing most frequently, and then typically they're going to be using the ends a little bit less, right? So you end up with a bell-shaped curve. Now, it won't work with this axis. You have to think of it as frequency of using this niche aspect. And that's what gives you that flat line or range of resources that they're actually going to be doing. Are we okay with that? All right. And then you could do the same thing for this one. Again, if we're looking for the niche aspect, what we had at the end of class last time is they just had a flat line representing the range that they were using. But that flat line is based on the frequency again. And let's give this one a different shaped curve. Maybe something like this. Okay, still bell-shaped, so that there's still kind of an optimum. This would be what they prefer. This would be what they prefer. But kind of like when we were discussing tolerance, which plays into a role here. They could be narrow or they can be wide, right? So that's why I wanted to give you like two different shaped ones to think about. All right. And so this is what translates into the range that they use for each niche. And to build our three-dimensional niche, or two-dimensional, well, I got excited there for a minute. Our two-dimensional niche. All we have to do is say, okay, this is the end of the range for this aspect. And it looks like it goes to about here for the other aspect. And then for this, their range goes from here to about here. And then this would be the two-dimensional box, the niche that species occupies for those two niche aspects. That's how they got their box. Okay. And I said this is what I would expect that you would be able to do a two-dimensional niche on your exam in 2 weeks from today. Now, as we go forward and look at some more of the pictures in this PowerPoint, what you're going to see is they sometimes will have a box. The one I first showed you had a box, so that they're very much building this way, right? But some of the other ones we're going to see are going to curve it like this so that it's within the box, but kind of ignores those corners. So you'll see circles, in other words. And all that's really saying is when you get out here, when we're at the tips, what does our law of tolerance say? That at best they're surviving, right? And so if you're at the tails for both of these, you're not talking about healthy individuals or a healthy population. And so that's where you get kind of those rounded circles out of these ranges. So I just want you to be aware of that when we look at some of these pictures. All right. Any questions on how to build a two-dimensional niche? I don't know how to put the third one on. Right, because it's got to come out this way. And then we need a curve on that. But then I can make a three-dimensional box, right? I can do that, or at least I can if I think about it. I probably can't in front of you right now. But how to get the shape of that box is a little bit harder. All right. Okay, so this is where we are. We took one niche aspect, which they call one dimension, one niche dimension, we'll say that too. And then they added a second dimension, and then of course we got our third dimension. So we looked at those at the end of class. And then this one is a more rounded version, which we've already looked at. We talked about this one as well, where they soften those corners a little bit, and it includes a little bit more information. And so you wouldn't expect very many of this species, which I believe is a gnatcatcher. Out here, you would expect most of them to be over here at this peak. Right? That's where the peak of all of the aspects are coming together. All right, at the end of the class, some of you started asking about two. What if we had two species? So that's next, two species. This one's still using the box-shaped niches that we built, and it's showing you that you can have two species on the same graph, or 3, or 4, or 10. That gets very confusing. The higher the number, the harder it is for our brains to wrap around. And what you can see here is that species 1, so that's S1, is in the yellow box. Species 2 is in the blue box. And then the two do use some of the same resources, which is what's shaded in the green, overlap between the two species, which we have a whole slide over. It's called niche overlap. We're not that creative with our terms. However, when you see niche overlap, and I'll talk about this as we go along, it could have a lot of different meanings. For one thing, on this particular graph, the only two niche aspects they're considering are temperature and moisture. And they're probably looking at two species that are somewhat similar. That's why you would look at them to start with, to figure out how they're using their environment differently. And so while there's a little bit of overlap here in the temperature and moisture that they use in the environment, if we add a third dimension, that might help clarify, a fourth dimension, that might help clarify, and you'll see more of a separation to get those two, where they're going to bump and overlap here and there, but they probably don't overlap in every niche aspect. Does that make sense? Well, it's a lot of thinking about hypervolumes. All right. I like to put this one, and I think the next one is also very similar, because it's showing you basically how I drew our niche on the board. I'm not going to ask you to draw two species on the same niche like this by any means. We'll just stick with one two-dimensional niche. But in this case, they have species A, B, and C. And they're trying to show you how you build that particular niches by showing you the resource use, whatever this first dimension is, niche aspect is. And if you look at the top, A, B, and C are kind of in line, but here, A, C, B, right? They're using that resource a little bit differently. And you can see that in this particular case, for those two niche dimensions, there's overlap between those three species. And then we could continue to do that for multiple species. And so in this case, we got A through F, it looks like, on there. And so I mentioned last time that we do this using multivariate statistics, and nowadays they also build specific niche models. And so you might see one paper using something like a principal component analysis, which is a standard multivariate statistic. You may see others using some type of niche program that they're running in something like R, which is a statistical package. But they both kind of do the same thing. They're going to take multiple, like 15, 20, 30 niche aspects, crunch all of that together, see which aspects are related to one another, and then they're going to spit out something that looks like this, sorta. I say sorta because usually it's just a bunch of clumps of points, and then you go in and you kind of circle the points for each species, and then you end up with something that looks like this. And so that's where you would head. So this is giving you an example in 2 dimensions, but what we try to do as we add more dimensions is crunch the numbers so that we can still get an image like this and see the separation between the species. That makes sense? I'm not going to ask you to get that deep. I just want you to have a grasp of it if we can get it. All right, we'll come back to that idea of multi-dimensional hypervolume a little bit later. We're going to go back to like the nice little definitions of all of these terms now. Hopefully review just depends on what classes you've come up through. And so let's start with fundamental niche. The key to this definition is the organism is free of interference. Another way to think of that is competition between species, so that they can use all of the resources and all of the conditions, all of the niche aspects, anything they want to do, they can do it, basically. This is your ideal situation for a species. So if we're classifying this species, this is what they would love. This is where that's where you're going to find them in the world. This is where we're going to have peak, survive, grow, and reproduce. So when I'm talking to my freshmen, I always say is people. One of the things that drives our personal niches, we could look at it as a human race would be more appropriate probably, but if we think about our own personal niches, the thing that we compete for the most and interfere with each other with the most is cash. And so my fundamental niche would be if I had an unlimited amount of cash. And so to give you some ideas, I would probably have, I'd have one home in the cloud forest in Ecuador. I'd have one probably down in the Okavango. I told you about the Okavango. It's awesome, but I'd only want to be there like November, December when all the animals are there. The rest of the year when it's Kalahari Desert, I don't want to be there. So, that's just part of the year. I don't know. I might still teach sometimes, maybe like one class instead of like 16 classes. I don't teach 16 classes. I like it, okay, but I don't know that I'd come to work every day if I had all the money I needed. Faculty meetings? No way, right? You get the idea. You go think about your own niche, your own things. I might have more than one dog and one cat. All right. The realized niche, as you can tell by its name, that's supposed to be representing reality. And so this is where they're being locked into by environmental constraints, where the competition is putting them basically. And it's going to be a portion of their fundamental niche. And so in reality, I have one home. I can travel to some of those other places, but I can't afford to live there. Not yet. But I was daydreaming the other day about retiring from UTM and then moving to Africa and teaching there for a few years. It'll be fun. But the reality is most of us don't have the money to make all of our dreams come true. There are some subset of priorities that we make. In this case, they're not making their priorities based on money, of course. They're doing it based on competition or resources and what is available to them. All right, so to give you an example, which I think might pop up again a little bit later as we talk about niche aspects. If you have a species that becomes invasive, so what is an invasive species?
Non-native species.
Non-native, but that's not the only thing, because we have non-native species that are not invasive.
Right. With like,
Yeah, it grows uncontrollably, tends to have some type of environmental, it tends to be environmentally detrimental in some way, right? It's doing something like that. So what's happened is we've taken an organism from somewhere else and we've moved it into an environment in which it doesn't have good competitors or predators or all of those types of things that can kind of keep a population in check. And so that's pretty close to this, right? Pretty close to having a fundamental niche. So like European starlings and kudzu and zebra mussels, purple loosestrife. We saw nutria this summer at Reelfoot, so nutria. If you go back to the country where they came from, usually they're not showing that type of behavior because they have natural predators and parasites and diseases and competition and all that kind of stuff. And so if you go back to where they're from, they're in their realized niche. I'm just trying to get you to think about what it might look like. Okay? And we'll talk about some of that more as we go along. Any questions about fundamental and realized for now? Okay. Another way to kind of look at these is by the classic example of the barnacles. Have you all run across the barnacle example before? Some of you, it depends on probably who you had for freshman bio. I don't know that I do it in my freshman bio. I use some other stuff.
I feel like I've heard you mention it before. Right?
Yeah, I mentioned it also because Dr. Blanchard calls it balanus. And I learned it balanus, and I just giggle every time because I'm immature sometimes. I'll stick with balanus so I don't giggle. So stamulus is the smaller of the barnacles. They typically live at the top of the rock, and then the balanus is the larger of the two barnacles, and they typically live at the bottom of the rock. And so what we have is a tidal situation. And so at high tide, you can see the line at the top. All of these barnacles would be underwater, which is what they need. That's where they feed. They do have a little plate that can close that keeps them from drying out when they're exposed to air. But in order to feed, they need to be able to open up, and they have these little things called cirri that they stick out, and then they filter food from the water. Okay, so they need to be underwater to be successful. And if they're left out of the water for too long, then they will dry out and die. So even the ones that live on the higher part of the rock have to be submerged periodically. All right, and so there was this ecologist, his name was Connell, who did a series of very famous experiments, which is why this example comes up so often. And basically what he would do is he would remove some of the balanus down here, then put up a cage, and then make sure that nothing was able to establish itself there except for thamellus. And then at the top he did the same thing. He cleared out some of the thamellus, put in a cage, made sure that none of the thamellus settled there, and only allowed the balanus settle there if it wanted to. All right. And through those types of removal studies to see what happened, they were able to determine the niches of these two species. And so what I want us to pay attention to is the fundamental niche lines and the realized niche lines, right? That's our conversation that we're having right here. And the brown lines represent the little brown barnacle, and the blue line represents the balanus. And so what he found is if I remove some of the balanus down here, and I don't let them settle there, the thamellus will colonize it and grow just fine. In fact, it does very well. And so in other words, the thamellus can live anywhere along this rock, which is why the brown line for its fundamental niche includes the whole rock. On the other hand, if you do the opposite, if you remove the thamellus and you wait around to see if any balanus can live up there, you're going to be waiting a long time. they aren't able to colonize it, and they're not able to settle, or they might colonize, but they're not able to survive up there. And so you'll notice that this blue line, representing the fundamental niche for Balanus, only includes the lower half of the rock. So far, so good? Okay. So now if we look over at the realized niches, we'll notice that for Balanus, the blue lines, that the fundamental niche and the realized niche in this example are the same. They are where they want to be. They're using, at least for this niche aspect that we're looking at, they're using all of the environment that's available to them. They're not able to move into the top part of the rock. But for the Thamylus, look at this poor little tiny brown realized niche line. It's being very much limited to a portion of its fundamental niche, likely because it's smaller and it's easier for the Balanus to just land on top of it and smother it and take over that spot. So competition from the Balanus is forcing it into that part of its niche. Its realized niche is a portion of its fundamental niche. All right. Does everybody understand this diagram? It's a nice, neat little example, which is why this ends up in lots of textbooks, and I will bring it up, I think, at least a couple more times here and there. But as long as you know the foundations of this one, we can have conversations. Okay. So I've already defined this one. It is our niche overlap. And so this is when two or more species use a portion of the same resource at the same time. On these diagrams, a lot of times, just to help you visualize what they're talking about, I just have simple little two-dimensional niches. Keeping in mind that in reality we would have very complex multi-dimensional niches that we were looking at. So we have species A in a yellow circle, species B is the blue circle, and then the green is the resource, whatever that happens to be that they're overlapping, or the range of that resource that they're overlapping. So again, if we try to think of multi-dimensionally rather than two-dimensionally, like we have here, is we have this, weird, odd-shaped multi-volume for this species and a weird, odd-shaped multi-volume for this species, where we've incorporated lots of different aspects. If they are similar species, closely related species, odds are they're going to overlap maybe right here at this point, and then over here at this point, and maybe over here at this point. Okay. It doesn't have to be just for one or two niche aspects. And so you got this weird amorphic thing touching and overlapping occasionally. This was a big question, not the multidimensional part, just the niche overlap part, in my dissertation. Because I was looking, rather than, generally speaking, we're talking about niches for by strictest definition, you're saying by species. In reality, by population. And a lot of times what you would look at would be, and I'm going to show you some work some of my undergrads did here many years ago, I guess now at this point, at UTM, where we looked at overlap between the woodpecker species that live around here. And so traditionally you would look at niche overlap between red-bellied woodpeckers and downy woodpeckers. Right? You would do something like that. That's a very typical study that's done in this type of area. But as the research in the niches progressed, we began to realize that within a species or within a population, you would also see differences. And so some of the first studies compared the niche of a male red-cockaded woodpecker to a female red-cockaded woodpecker. And when they did that, they found that there was niche overlap between them, but not as much as you would expect. Right? And so when I was working on my dissertation, I was building out niche aspects, measuring niche aspects for yellow-bellied sapsuckers specifically. And yellow-bellied sapsuckers, they have a migration pattern where the males tend to stay in the southeastern United States. How large their population size in central Mississippi, where I was, would depend a little bit on how severe the weather was up north. So they're a little bit nomadic. They move and shift with the weather. The females, on the other hand, they go down to South America. And so within all of those data points I told you about in my big spreadsheet, very few of them were females, and most of those would have been during migration in the fall or migration back in the spring. Okay, so mostly it was males. And so I divided those males, which is easy to do in sapsuckers because there are plumage differences, into adult males and first winter males. Okay, so I was looking at niche overlap between adult males and the younger males. Like, was there any differences there? And I found some differences. And so when we got into the defense, so when you get your PhD or a master's, depending on the school you go to get your master's anyway, you have to go and you have to defend your research, which can be really scary because you sit in a room and your professor, your major professor's there, and then your committee is there, the people who have read your thesis and have hopefully been nice and guided you through doing your research. And they just batter you with questions and they make you defend everything. And so one of the big things that we discussed in my dissertation was this: does niche overlap actually lead to competition? And so for some niche aspects of the yellow-bellied sapsucker, the overlap between the adult and the juveniles would be like 97%. And so does that mean that they are overlapping are they actually competing? Is that something they're competing for? Is there something else going on? In other cases, the overlap might be more like 75%. And the answer is not clear, which is what we talked about. And I think it's the reason why they gave me my PhD, because I did a good job on this one thing. And the reason why it's not clear is because it really depends on how much of that resource is available to them. And so where the adults and the juveniles had the highest overlap was in the species of trees that they were using as food, which in Mississippi were things like mockernut hickories, sweet gums, some other types of hickories. They really like hickories. And then they used some vines and things, but that was kind of the bulk of it. And so, luckily, I became aware of this type of dichotomy, this question, before it got to the point where I'm defending my thesis. And so what I would do is, when I saw a sapsucker using a tree and making sap wells in it, that's what they do, they make those little holes in lines that you see on trees, that's how they feed. I would flag that tree. And then in the summer, I would come back and I would do a vegetation analysis around that tree in 1/4 hectare plots. And then I would do random plots. And what I was trying to do to see if they were selectively feeding on the hickories. Like, were they feeding on hickories, whereas if you just went out randomly, you wouldn't necessarily run into one. Like, what is the most common tree I run into randomly, basically, that type of thing. And what I found was they are selectively feeding on hickories, right, basically. And so to the answer to the question, when the adults and juveniles had 97% overlap, were they really competing or not? The answer is probably not. Because there's tons of hickories out there. And so that resource is abundant. And there's enough hickories for all of the sapsuckers that came and visited central Mississippi in the wintertime. But let me give you another example. Another thing that I measured was what parts of the trees the sapsuckers were using. And when you start to look at that, there's more separation. There's less overlap between the adults and the juveniles. With the adults being able to use the trunks and larger branches and then pushing the juveniles off into other areas. And the answer to the question, is that competition, what I argued would be possibly, because we never want to say 100%, right? We're scientists. But probably. Because what's happening is I think I talked about this in this class too, right? We talked about sapsuckers and how girdling alters the tree. Was that this class? Yeah, okay. Because probably what's happening is where the adults are feeding are places that have increased sugar over other parts of the trees. And they're going to have first option there, right? They're going to be more dominant. They know how to find those. And the juveniles are going to be less efficient at doing that. They're mostly just watching the adults to see if they're doing that first winter anyway. that kind of thing. So it's probably more real than the first one. I have a picture of pollinators on this slide because there are a lot of pollinators. Are they competing with each other? Or is there enough nectar to go around? In other words, because they have niche overlap, they're all using nectar, they're overlapping in that aspect of their niche. Are they competing?
Not necessarily, because a lot of them are specified for specific types of plants.
We're not there yet, but yeah, that's one thing.
I mean, just from what I see in the picture.
But there are some on the same plants. Well, maybe not in this picture, but there could be. There would be in the same plant. Need to find one that has one plant and all of them on it.
There definitely is competition for some.
There's likely some competition, and we can break it down and look at it more closely, like looking at the shape of the flower, the color of the flower. Those would be niche aspects that would become important, right? But at the end of the day, this is one of those places where how much competition could be debatable, because plants produce copious quantities of nectar, right? However, if you've had some botany, you do know things like the flower shape is specific to the pollinator that they want, right, essentially. So it is a little bit more complex. And that's pretty much true anytime you're talking about niche overlap anyway. So if I ask this question on the exam, does niche overlap lead to competition? This is just a yep and move on, right? No, this is a good example where you're going to have to really explain to me what the outcome would be, I guess. I don't have a good way to say it for some reason. My brain, I felt like I was doing pretty good until now. In other words, you need to say maybe, and then you need to explain to me why it's maybe, right? And that's a result of the type of class that you're in. So I felt like this is a good place to talk about it, especially with the exam coming up in 2 weeks. I'll give you another example. This one I feel like is kind of obvious. Like if I ask this after this discussion we've just had, I feel like you know that this is something that's going to require you to think about and write an intelligent answer. But some of it comes down to understanding the questions. And if you don't understand the question, to ask me. So later this semester, we're going to talk about mating systems. And one common question I'll ask would be, under what conditions is polygyny possible? Actually, I want to do polyandry. Let's do polyandry. So polyandry is where you have one female and lots of males, right, which is not your typical system. And so the answer I commonly get is it's one female with multiple males. That's a definition of polyandry, but it doesn't answer that question. It doesn't tell me what conditions are needed for polyandry. In other words, that question is assuming you know what polyandry is, and I'm wanting you to tell me why, when, and why does that occur. Does that make sense? So if you want full credit on that question, that's what I need. We will eventually do this in class, but the quick answer is when you have role reversal. When the male is doing parental care and frees up the female, that's when you have polyandry. So that's the answer to that question. That won't be till exam like 2 or something. All right, back on topic though. Is everybody comfortable with, does niche overlap lead to competition? Okay. All right. So this one again is just showing some niche overlap. So we've got 3 species of sparrow on here. We have Henslow sparrow, grasshopper sparrow, and Savannah sparrow. You can see that when they did their mathematical model, the Henslow sparrow separated out nicely. They probably rejoiced. And then you have overlap between the Savannah sparrow and grasshopper sparrow, but they are still fairly distinct, so they probably were still pretty happy with their model when they built it. I put this picture at this point because it does have some niche overlap, but also because this is an example of a multivariate graph. Okay? And so if you look at the axes here, this is not one niche aspect, and this is not one niche aspect, although in this case it is. It's just, well, no, it's not. It is a group of aspects that they have collectively called territory size. All right? And so neither one of them is a single niche aspect. I know this because the axis is all weird. Here's 0, and then it goes negative this way, positive this way. And up here you've got a 0, and it goes positive one way and negative this way. And so what we have here is something like a principal components or a discriminant analysis. And what they're doing is they're loading multiple variables onto each axis. Okay, so that's why it took me for a loop for a second right here. And so this one, they're labeling it territory size, but it's still a combination of several different aspects that they measured that all relate to territorial size. Otherwise, it wouldn't have this weird axis. Down here, it's a little bit more clear. I don't know why they haven't given us an overall category like territory size over here. It looks to be more like your habitat description. And so as you move this way along the axis, the, in this case, Henslow sparrow tends to prefer things like little cover, trees that have a higher basal area, which basically is their size. Their dense vegetation cover, as that increases, as those types of factors increase, you increase this species. As you move away from those types of factors towards bare ground, and again, they would have measured probably several factors here, not just how much bare ground there is, then you get more towards savanna sparrows and grasshopper sparrows. Overall, what this does for us is it makes it hard to interpret the axes. And if you actually go to graduate school and you get into this kind of stuff, or you take some multivariate classes, this is probably where you're going to spend a lot of your time, is just how do you interpret these axes. But what it does overall, and the reason why we do these things, is because when you come up here, again, what you would get initially would be in a cluster of points, right? And then they put a circle around it, saying here's this species, and you have a cluster of points here, and put a circle around it, saying here's this species, and so forth. But we can look at this and understand what's happening. Right? It's pretty easy for us to see that Henslow sparrow has different environmental needs than these two sparrows, which is the point of, most likely a point of this particular project. And I would guess they probably wanted the grasshopper sparrow to pull out a little bit better, because it's a species of concern as well. Savanna sparrow, not so much. You can see those in ornithology in the spring if you want. All right, any questions about that generally? That's as deep as we're getting into these types of things. All right. So niche breadth and niche width. You see both of these terms used in publications. So that's why I have them both over here, but they mean the same thing. These are some words that we really need to work on for a few minutes, because likely you have encountered them before, but I want you to expand how you think about them a little. And so as you're talking about niche breadth, the range of resources is where, if we go back, well, we've got this graph here. If we go back to this graph, if you have a curve that's good and broad, then we say that that's a wide niche breadth or a wide width. If you have one that's more narrow like this, then we would say it's a narrow niche breadth. And then we tend to apply two terms to them. The term generalist and specialist. And as you're looking at the graph down here, their generalist that they're referring to in this textbook example is a raccoon. I also give you possum and coyote. A specialist would be, I have koala up there on the slide, but in their diagram they have a panda. And they are good examples of generalist and specialist. However, almost always in the textbooks, they give you an example of what the animals eat. Right? That's basically what they're talking about here. They give koala because I can ask even a class of kids in high school, what do koalas eat? And they're going to say eucalyptus, which is very specific, and that definitely makes them a specialist. And then I can ask them, what does a raccoon eat? And they're going to say everything. Anything and everything. Or possum, And that's easy to grasp. It's easy to understand. But in reality, if you start to do niche research, what you're going to do is you're going to look at the niche breadth for every aspect that you measure. And one of those aspects, or multiples of those aspects, may be related to their diet. Absolutely. And so if you look at the niche aspect of diet for koalas, it's going to be very narrow. They're definitely a specialist there. But that doesn't mean that they're specialized in every single aspect of their niche. And that's what I need us to expand to think about. All right? And so as we begin to think about that, any question about this slide before we go to the next one? I'm ready to think about it. On to the next slide. As you begin to think about that, that has a big application, and we talked, some of you came out of ConBio, we talk about this in ConBio to some extent, because most endangered species are considered specialists. And they become endangered, why?
Because they run out of that.
Yeah, whatever it is that they're specialized on is under threat. Whatever that happens to be. It could be what they eat, but it could also be something else. And so if you go into the area of conservation biology and you are tasked under the Endangered Species Act to study a species and find out why it's declining, then this is the type of research you're going to do. You're going to think of as many different niche aspects for that species as you can, and then you're going to go and you're going to investigate that. And so if you've had ConBio, I talk about red cockaded woodpeckers a lot. It gets into one of those areas where I know the most about birds. In one of our years, we read a book about red cockaded woodpeckers. If you're interested, it's called A Stillness in the Pines. It's very good. And then I probably didn't share that too much, but I also, when I was in grad school, my best buddy in grad school was doing exactly this. He was looking at the niche overlap between male and female red cockaded woodpeckers and putting that into perspective as how they were using. He was doing a specific forest. I'm not going to remember the name right now. I went down there with him several times. It was south of Starkville. I don't remember the name of the forest. But he was doing it for a specific area. And when I was in grad school, I was in the biology department. He was in the wildlife and fisheries department. And his work, we were doing exactly the same thing, which is why we became great buds. Became big buds. Because I was doing niche overlap and working with niche models for sapsuckers, and he was doing niche overlap and working with niche models for red cockaded woodpeckers. But he was doing it funded by, I believe it was the U.S. Forest Service, who was needing more information to better manage their population of red cockaded woodpeckers. So he was a very specific project that he was on. All right. And so if you begin to look at red cockaded woodpeckers as an example of this, we want to measure lots of niche aspects. And when he did, at the time that he was doing that research, there were lots of people researching red cockaded woodpeckers, and they still do. And they're debating whether to move it from endangered to threatened at this point, which is good news. But what they were finding was the males and females do feed differently. If I remember correctly, they feed at different heights. I don't remember which one was higher and which one's lower, but there were a lot of subtle differences in the way that they use the environment. Another thing he found, because he had them radio marked so that he could go and find them and watch where they were eating and feeding and stuff, is that they were not habitat specialists. They're habitat generalists. That they would feed in the pine forest where they are typically associated with. They're fire climax species. They like pine stands that are regularly burned. But they would go into hardwood stands and feed as well. So they're not, at least not as specialized as people thought they were in terms of diet. Right? So we got to rule that out. But what they were specialized on were the trees that they used to build their cavities, which is why I have that picture behind me. Right? And so they need a tree that has a particular diameter, that has a fungal infection that has impacted its hardwood, that's still alive. They like living trees. And then it takes them about 3 years to make a cavity. I went to a presentation at ASB, and she put the average at 10 years. I was like, wow, that sounds really long compared to what I know about red cockaded woodpeckers. She was in her first semester, I think, too. So she'll fine-tune it a little bit. And so I went back and I looked up, and apparently it ranges from 3 to 7. 10 would be possible, but on an outlier a little bit. So 3 to 7 years to make a cavity. To give you a comparison, a red-bellied woodpecker here in Tennessee does not excavate into a living tree, first of all. They're the only ones that do, the red cockaded woodpeckers. And if they are hard-pressed, so this wouldn't be their preference, but if they're hard-pressed, they can make a cavity in 3 days. During the breeding season, they would probably like 7 to 10 days. And so you've got them with very specific habitat needs, where they need a tree of a particular diameter with a fungus infection, and then they can't make them quickly. They make them very slowly. And so what's limiting their success, their reproductive success, is being able to have those cavities. And then once they establish a cavity, they use it repeatedly, whereas the red belly doesn't. Cavities are just trash for them. They can go make another cavity. In particular territory for red belly, they're going to have lots of cavities, some for roosting, some for nesting, all that kind of stuff. And so what they do, if you look at this picture really carefully, is luckily red-cockaded woodpeckers take very readily to artificial cavities, nest boxes, right? And so if you look carefully, that's what this one is doing. There's a seam that goes all the way around it. And this is called a cavity insert. And so I went out with the woodpecker biologist at Noxubee National, which is at Starkville. That's where I did my research. And it was amazing. He had done them for years. He'd been the red-cockaded woodpecker biologist for a long time. But he'd take his chainsaw, and to me, this is what it looked like. And then he'd take out the square. It wasn't quite that simple, but that's kind of how my brain interpreted it. It was rather quick. And then he'd put in the insert. He put wood putty in there to secure it. And then they would start wounds around it, which you can kind of see this is all sap covered. That's a snake deterrence that the red-cockaded woodpeckers do. Okay? So the whole point of that story is, as you're looking at endangered species, it's not always food. You've got to measure as many of these aspects as you can so that you can zero in on what the problem is. And then once you collect that data, you can act to correct that problem, like in this case, putting in artificial cavities to supplement the cavities that they already have. All right, any questions about any of that? This will be another one of those questions I could ask, right? Are endangered species generalist or specialist? If you just put specialist, are you going to get full credit?
No.
You're going to have to explain. Bummer. But does everybody understand what I'm getting at? Okay, good. All right. Oh, we're at 8:50. Let's take our 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk more about niches. I told y'all you're in trouble with